Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined today on this International Women's Day edition of the Full Scottish by two of our finest feminist friends. Over here we've got Professor Alison Phipps, the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Language and Arts. And over here we've got Councillor Lisa Marie Hughes, the SNP Councillor for Renfrew North and Braehead. Good morning, how are we?
Good morning, very well, thank you.
Excellent. Well, it's always good to hear that people are feeling well, because our first story today is about the coronavirus. We have now a total of 16 cases in Scotland. We've had the first deaths in the UK this week as well. And we've seen just a lot of things to talk about here. First of all, we're seeing some panic buying, which is usually a mistake in virtually any circumstance. It leaves people who are a wee bit less well off in a worse position than if everybody just took a deep breath and behaved a bit more sensibly. But we are seeing increasing worry, I think, which is not entirely unreasonable. This is a virus that is spreading before people show symptoms. We are seeing a rise, not massive rises yet, but we are seeing an increasing number of people being diagnosed each day. Alison, what's your feeling about how this is progressing, and what's your feeling on how the public reaction has been?
It's really clear that a lot of people are afraid, and that fear often comes from the way in which information is communicated. But also it's a really natural reaction to not quite knowing how to control something that's out with your own control. And so you often see in circumstances like this that people will do things that are completely irrational, like building fortresses of toilet rolls and clearing Asda and Aldi and any other supermarket out of hand sanitiser and soap, which everybody, when they stop and think, knows is not in their best interests. What is always in our best interests is looking after one another, is making sure that everyone has access to good, free healthcare, that everyone has access to what they need to stay clean and to maintain their dignity in whatever condition they're in. And so therefore panic buying is a really irrational but also understandable response when people are acting out of fear rather than taking a beat and pausing and then listening and deciding who it is they trust to listen to. And I think that's one of the things for me that's been interesting this week is who is it people trust? And so in an age where fake news and fear of expertise or scepticism about expertise has been writ large across the public domain, I think it's really interesting that we're hearing people actually once again wanting to listen to the experts on this, the people who have devoted their life to researching public health, the people who are our chief medical officers, and that they are the people that at the end of the day we can trust as best we possibly can to give us the information that we need that will keep everybody well and healthy. And so for me, I think the gulf that has emerged between the politicians we can trust to give us fair information and those that we are sceptical about is really important in terms of how people are responding and reacting. And the panic buying is a sign of that lack of trust in the political forces that have been making statements. And I think it's been a little after the fact that we've seen politicians saying, oh no, you don't need to do this. Yeah.
And Lisa, I mean, as a politician, I mean, the council has not got the highest level of preparedness planning to do. You're not, quite in the position of the health secretary, for example. But what's your kind of position from within the council? Has there been a lot of thought given to how the council manages this?
There is, of course, across councils and health boards, because I sit in our IJB as well as the council. Of course, there is thought into managing this. I think it's really important that when we're giving messages to people, we remind them of things like we're in the containment stage. If you're doing things such as making sure you're washing your hands, making sure that when you cannot get access to soap and water to wash your hands, you're using sanitiser, making sure that if you are displaying symptoms and have been to one of the category 2 areas, you're maybe reporting that to your doctor. These things are all important, but really, we're business as usual at the moment. Councils, health boards, the health secretary and the government are planning. but people can go about their daily lives at the moment without too much concern. You want to take some precautions if you are perhaps a moderate risk person, if you're someone who has a low immunity, if you're a bit elderly. I'm not suggesting that not having a wee backup of things is a good idea, but I agree a lot with what's previously been said. If we panic by too much, and I think we saw this when it was coming around Brexit as well, a bit of preparedness is a good thing if you can prepare to do it. In part because if you prepare early because you can afford to do that, you're then not pushing up prices for people when it comes to more of a crisis situation. I think ensuring that we're all looking after each other would be our message too. We're putting out regular messaging in conjunction with the NHS, with our health board and the Scottish Government, directing people to the right websites and just making sure we're being really consistent about the message, because I think you're right. I think we need to hear from experts. We don't need to hear sensationalist media shouting about things as if it is a complete disaster.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've seen a couple of really disturbing things. We saw, for example, there was an artist, or a curator at an exhibition in London who was coming in from Vietnam and was told, we're worried that having an Asian person at the exhibition might stop people wanting to come in, so please don't come anymore. I've heard from a number of Chinese students in Glasgow that they're scared to be here. They don't feel like the government knows what it's doing. They would rather go back to China, where they feel like the government has got a really tight hold on this, even though there's massively more people infected in China than there are here. And we've also heard a number of cases of Chinese people being abused, being threatened, being assaulted even. Which you would think assaulting them was just going to bring you into closer contact. If you thought they were carrying the virus, you know, why would you want to get their blood on you? But what can we do about this kind of paranoia? This kind of, I mean, it's all part of that same panic response, I think. What do you think we can do to try and address that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really clear that telling people to stop being racist doesn't work. It just makes people more prone to defensive behaviour and to saying, well, I'm not being racist, I'm just protecting my own, and you end up with more and more fortresses. So kindness, thought, pressing pause, thinking about the situation, questioning your own assumptions, all of those things are really helpful. It never helps to turn around and try and find somebody who might be in a more vulnerable position than yourself to blame for anything. Yeah. And I think, you know, I really feel for our Chinese students. We have a large body of Chinese students in the city of Glasgow. Quite a lot of them have family and friends back home who they're concerned about at the moment. So they too are worried and fearful. But also, if you imagine listening to public health broadcasts in a language that is not your own, then you're not going to understand absolutely everything that's said. And so you are going to need a moment for somebody to help you interpret and understand how this culture might deal with fear, as opposed to how your own culture might deal with fear. And whilst there'll be some parallels, there'll also be some things which are really different. So again, I think just making sure you're alongside people who are in a more vulnerable position than yourself. That you actually have taken time to think, who's elderly in the community? What can I do to check they're okay? Who's here as a guest in our society? What can I do to make sure that they understand what we're saying? That they know what it means when people talk about hand sanitiser, that they know why people are talking about a virus with a particular codified name, that they understand the language being used, because that's good for them, that allays fear, but it's also then good for everybody, because you're building and increasing the number of people who collectively are working to keep everybody safe. And I think that's true in this situation. I also think it's true in every situation we find ourselves in. And what we do know is that over the last few years, led from the Westminster government, we have seen a rise in the tolerance of xenophobia and in the blaming of people more vulnerable than ourselves for a whole range of manufactured societal ills. It has led to a situation that we see particularly Chinese people now being subject to in the country. It is bad for everybody when we do this. it doesn't produce a society that's healthy and flourishing, and where there is kindness and understanding and tolerance, and where there is robust debate about what might be the best ways for us to protect each other. So for me, these are the things that we can do. But it's not about thinking about me first. It's actually about saying, who am I in this? What are my privileges? And how can I then use those to help and sustain other people who are in a less strong position than myself?
And Lisa, as Alison says, there are different responses from different countries. I mean, there's been a lot of talk as well about the United States, for example, where the president seems to think, well, that he knows, I mean, he's actually said he knows more about viruses than people who work for the Centre for Disease Control. I mean, sometimes it's very difficult to talk about how Donald Trump behaves. But you know, we've seen things like people being charged to be in quarantine, and so they're ending up, people are not wanting to get tested in case they end up having to spend a fortune on their bills. What do you think what do you think are maybe the good and bad things about the way Scotland is approaching this, or in Scotland versus the UK and versus maybe the rest of the world?
Well, I think Scotland has been, as the Scottish Government's been really level about the approach. As Alison says, if you begin to make everything sound like it's a disaster and that you, as one person, know better than the multitude of experts, we're very fortunate in Scotland to have lots and lots of experts in these things, centres for excellence, which is wonderful.
And also politicians who tend to have an interest in expert opinion.
Yes. I think that's really crucial. You have, on the one hand, a Donald Trump, and to an extent, sadly, a Boris Johnson, who think that their opinion is above everyone else's, and certainly as the responsibility you hold as a politician is to listen to the experience of people who know what they're talking about and make a decision based on that. When you're elected, you're responsible to the people. I would like to think that my constituents understand that I am going, listening, finding out what the most important thing for them is, and putting that information out in a calm manner. I certainly think the Scottish Government are doing that. I don't think that the US are doing that by any stretch. They've escalated to emergency status in lots of places where we're still in containment, which is thought to be the right thing to be. I also think, of course, in Scotland, we have much better protections around things like workers' rights, much less people on 0 hours contracts, which means that there is a degree of comfort for people around going and being tested, which I think is a really positive thing. People who may be ill should never be afraid to step forward and ask for the help. That's why we have an NHS. It's why we have specialists in all the areas that we do. Yeah.
And just finally, before we move on from this, we've seen a number of political impacts from this. We've seen, or not even political, but just other impacts. We've seen, for example, that flights have plummeted. Number of flights have plummeted. The amount of pollution in China has declined massively. It might be the biggest impact that we have on climate change this year, is the fact that a great deal of activity in China has shut down. We're seeing in the United States, a lot of people now are talking with the election and everything happening. People are saying this is why we need universal healthcare, is so that people don't have to be afraid. And even in this country, we've seen rules on statutory sick pay changed, which hopefully will be something that can be developed as we go forward. What do you think are there any other positives that we can take from this? Is there anything else that we can learn from it, or anything else that we can gain from it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for every case of panic buying, you've also got people who are phoning each other and checking in on each other, and those are the local things that you can actually look at and check. But I think there's a number of things around the way that people are reassessing their priorities and having to ask themselves, what is actually important to me in this situation? Where do I need to be? Who do I need to be with? Is this flight absolutely necessary? Does this meeting have to take place in these circumstances? Is what I think is important to me the most important thing, or is there a wider collective need in play at the moment? So we've had a really interesting case in my own work this week. So for most of the week I've been on strike, but one of the decisions that I've had to take on a day when I have been working was the decision not to take 25 people to Ghana. And that decision wasn't made because the Foreign and Commonwealth Office advice says that we should not travel to Ghana, but because the authorities in Ghana have said that if you come from a country where there is a case of the virus, you will be put into quarantine for 14 days. So for a workshop that's about building trust across countries in the global south, who in 2 cases do have cases of the virus and in the others do not, the best advice that I have taken, which has been from the funders, from the university, from public health authorities and from the immigration authorities and public health authorities in Ghana, has been to cancel this visit. Now that's costly. That means that my team and myself have to think about the economic impact of that. But actually, ultimately, people's health and safety and our ability to trust one another as a team in future is far more important. And I think that prioritising, that thinking through of what does it take to live in our small teams, in our workplaces, in our homes and families and neighbourhoods, and ultimately in our countries and in this world, in such a way that we can trust one another, that is always going to be the route to peace as opposed to a route to defensiveness and consumer warfare, which is what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah. So we would just remind you, the key advice is make sure your hands are clean. Don't try to avoid touching your face too much. And if you have any concerns, the NHS Inform website is full of information. If you have symptoms and you're concerned, you can call 111, call the NHS and ask them for advice. And you can also, if you're thinking of travelling, go to the Fit for Travel website and have a look there. That's got all the Foreign Office advice on where is safe, where there are restrictions. And if you're coming back, especially from north of Italy, Iran, South Korea, China, some other parts of the Far East, then again, just keep an eye on yourself. Try not to go outside too much until you're sure that you're safe. The vast majority of people are safe just now. There's no, as we've said, there is no need to panic. It's just to kind of keep yourself safe, keep an eye on yourself, watch out for symptoms, and well, fingers crossed, we'll all do fine as we go forward. But we have to move on now, and we have just heard this week the Scottish budget was announced. Now, I think first and foremost we have to give great credit to Kate Forbes, thrown into an incredibly difficult situation. Firstly, by Derek Mackay's unfortunate, and I mean unfortunate in the sense of the situation being unfortunate, not the unfortunate loss of somebody in his situation. But Derek Mackay left government the day before the budget was due to be announced, and Kate Forbes stepped in with some real panache, I thought, really impressively. She's managed to steer the budget through Parliament, and this has all happened while dealing with the fact that the UK government has delayed its own budget to the point where she was setting a budget without actually knowing how much money she has to play with, which obviously in the Scottish context, without real borrowing ability, is a really impressive feat to have got this done at all. She has written to Rishi Sunak, the new Chancellor, basically urging him to get the UK budget sorted out quickly, to get some certainty into the Scottish situation. But Lisa, you've got a council budget to set this week, and again, you're kind of one step further down the chain, where the UK government hasn't set its budget, so the Scottish government budget is somewhat provisional, and then you're having to set a budget based on that. How are you looking at, first of all, the Scottish budget and then your own situation?
Well, we are working on the basis that the Scottish Government will have been very sensible when setting their budget. So we are setting our budget on the basis of what they have provisionally passed. I have to, firstly, can I just say that I think it's a complete dereliction of duty on behalf of the UK Government that they are setting their budget on the day that Scottish councils are legally required to set theirs. So they're essentially, there are 2 stages of budget before ours, and they chose that day. And when questioned on this, one of the things they said was, well, we'll have until later on that day, which I just think is horrific. Our councils, 32 local authorities, are just supposed to wait and see what we're given. So I am grateful that the Scottish Government have gone ahead and set a budget that means we at least provisionally know what we're working for. That's obviously incredibly important because we have to set budgets so that we can provide frontline services, things like social care, our contribution to health, things like education. We plan to do that. Our budget is tomorrow. I am hoping it will go through. We're a minority administration. It would mean that we could move forward, and then we will wait and see if all of the shiny promises given by the UK government follow through. I don't expect them to, I'll be honest. So we are working on the basis that the Scottish Government budget is the budget we are working from, and our grant from that is our grant.
Yeah, and what do you make of the Scottish budget? We've seen, for example, more health and social care spending than ever before. It's gone above £15 billion. We've seen slight changes to the income tax rates. We're making, again, Scotland slightly more progressive. We've seen a few other announcements. What's kind of jumped out at you from the budget?
I think in a situation where, to a degree, we don't actually know what we're walking into while we wait for the UK government's budget, the Scottish Government have set a pretty progressive budget. I think the variations in income tax are really important. They mean that those who really can't afford to pay so much pay a bit less, and that those of us who can pay a wee bit more, which means we can continue to deliver really crucial free services, the NHS, free access to university education, the free sanitary products programme that is about to flow through, which I think is wonderful. My own council backed it just last week in a cross-party motion. It is something that is so crucial. We can keep continuing to do these things, and I think the budget allows us to do that. I think things like free travel for under 18s is a great thing. Mm-hmm. You know, these are people who we're supporting children to get to school, supporting them to get to college and university, perhaps supporting younger carers who can use that free travel to go about to go about and do things to support their families, and just making it easier for people. We've all been a young person trying to get a job where your minimum wage pay just about covers your bus fare and then a wee bit more spending money. This takes a bit of that pressure away. I think the focus on climate change is really incredibly important. We've got a lot of work to do. Again, my own council we have a climate emergency working group, and we're working towards that. So keen to see how that flows through and how councils can tap into it, because we want to do as much as we can locally. I think given the circumstances, it's a pretty progressive budget. Yeah. Obviously, I would always like more money for local authority, but you can't have everything.
Yeah. And Alison, as we said, there's a number of quite interesting issues there. What's leapt out at you from this whole debate? Is there something in the budget itself or the process that's got us here?
I mean, all credit, first of all, to Kate Forbes. I mean, absolutely astonishing job that she's done in, I cannot imagine a tougher set of circumstances. No. And to just come through in the way that she has, and you use the word panache, I think, you know, really, really quite an extraordinary performance, and great to see that happening.
Yeah, and a very young woman as well.
Absolutely.
Not a lot of
and somebody
experience.
with a constituency that is a long way from Edinburgh. So again, these issues that affect women in particular at the moment who have constituencies that are rural, these questions that I know we'll come back to later, you know, they're all there. But yeah, so first of all, I mean, real credit to her for stepping in and doing that. And to those who decided to give her that chance. You know, it takes people deciding to give you a chance for you to build up the practice to be able to show what you can do. And I think the people who make those decisions are often not always given the credit. So that really leapt out at me first and foremost. The difference between the shambles that we're seeing in Westminster, and you've just described the situation you're in, which I hadn't realised until now, but the absolutely unconscionable position that you're put in, where you have to make careful, thoughtful, rational decisions in no time. So you're forced into emergency thinking as opposed to good, reasoned thinking, and with no choice about that. So the work that councils are doing to really think through how they might set budgets, and all the other authorities dependent on those decisions, because this isn't just one budget, this is the council budgets, and then that's all the budgets that flow through from that. So for me, it's about the refugees, it's about the asylum support, it's actually about the destitution crisis within the city of Glasgow, and that is really where you see the people who are in the greatest positions of vulnerability, and also have the greatest knowledge of how to survive that. The people from whom we really always need to learn and go to first, if we really want to see how it is you might navigate these incredibly difficult situations. So here we have a Westminster government actually once again squeezing as hard as possible the most vulnerable, the homeless people who depend on these services, the asylum seekers who depend on services, the refugees who are moving and transitioning, depending on our public services. So for me that leapt out, and the attempt made to at least try and bring as much reason and possibility into that. And then for me it was a bit of a trip down memory lane. Yeah, I grew up in Sheffield in the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire as it was in the day. It was twopence anywhere in the city for anybody under 18 on a bus. And it made such a difference. You know, every house in Sheffield would have a little tray somewhere with 2p pieces. And for 4p, you could go anywhere in the city. And the buses were full. And the buses were therefore places where people met one another and cared for one another. So the isolationism that comes with driving everywhere, the isolationism that comes from bus fares that are so expensive, all of that wasn't there for young people. We would meet each other on the buses, and we would learn to live together on the buses, and we would get out to the Peak District on the buses, and we'd get off at Fox House because that was within the city boundaries, and then we'd go for a walk together, and then we'd come back, and all of that just came back to me with this motion, which was part of getting the budget done, where Kate Forbes listened to the Green Party's proposals and saw that this was win-win-win. You know, this is good for everybody, this is good for society, this is good for climate change, it's good for public transport, it is good for cross-party working, and here you have this lovely flagship policy that is now being put forward that was brought out of two different parties, and which I think we will see a real difference as a result of it to many people of free travel. We know what free travel has done for the elderly. We know what it means when you get your bus pass. We know what this has done for so many in that category, and how it has transformed their lives and meant that they have mobility and that they can meet people on a bus. I regularly travel by bus because for years I've not had a car, and when I get on a bus I've seen it's largely peopled by people over 60. Now it's going to be an intergenerational bus, and that's good for everyone because we really need to bridge those generational divides. It's a huge step forward, and I think far more radical than people have actually yet understood, and so that's what leapt out at me. And
potentially a huge boon for the environment as well as the social benefits that you pointed out. And you mentioned something that's not technically part of the budget, but something else that did come up that I just wanted to highlight, because we've seen the government down south talking about getting rid of the tampon tax, while Scotland is streaking ahead and saying, no, let's just get rid of that altogether. Let's just get rid of that tax on being a woman altogether. What's your take on this?
So as a woman going through the menopause, I'm a little galled that it's come now.
A little bit late for you. Yeah.
You know, I mean, it'd be nice to get that money back, but yep, it's great. I mean, period poverty is absolutely a thing. It absolutely should be tackled. There shouldn't be a tax on your gender. And isn't it great that we're now at a place where every time I go into the bathrooms, the toilets, and I see a basket in public buildings and in an awful lot of third sector buildings where people are invited to take what they need. Don't hoard, don't panic take, just take what you need. This just acknowledges what every woman has known when they have been menstruating, when they've been caught out, that sometimes you just don't have what you need with you. Sometimes your period comes early. Sometimes it's heavier than you're expecting. And that you are not going to be in a situation in Scotland where you are going to be feeling the shame and indignity of worrying that you'll bleed and that the bleeding will show. This is huge. This is huge. This is something I would want for everybody in the world. And I know because of my work that this isn't just about us in Scotland as women, this is about women all over the world, because one of the major barriers to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are about dignity of women and building equality for women, one of the major barriers to women going to school, to children going to school, to girls in school, is after they reach the age of the menarche, when they start to menstruate, the lack of toilet provision, the lack of sanitary provision. We have so much work to do. So my big plea around this and it's an International Women's Day plea, is for every one time you do this for yourselves as women in Scotland, you see this, think about women somewhere else in the world and do something that might help that. Toilet twinning is a great thing to do, or other ways in which you might support your sisters in other parts of the world where people are less fortunate to actually have access to the same dignity that we can now enjoy as women in this country.
Yeah, and Lisa, I mean, this is something I first remember my sister and one of her friends talking about this. I think it was 1991. I know that because I know what gig we were going to when they were talking about it. But you know, they were saying, well, why aren't these things free? And why it's taken 30 years since my sister, and I'm sure she wasn't the first person to think of this. Why is it taking so long, and why is it that Scotland is taking the lead here when there's so many other countries around, so many rich countries in the world that are still kind of talking about, as we said, like in England, still talking about just maybe cutting the tax on it?
Why has it taken so long? Because men have been in charge. I firmly believe that if men had been having periods for the last, the entire time that people have been alive, this would have been solved a long time ago. And actually, one of my male colleagues said that in Chambers last week, which I thought was wonderful. It's nice when men get on board with these things. And why are we moving forward? Because Scotland's a progressive society. I do think that having women in leadership across both politics and all of the other sectors, the third sector particularly, there's been a real voice around it there because there are people who deal with people who experienced the most deprivation from these things who are most affected by it. But I think also if you talk to, our cultural partners, they're often saying these things are stopping people engaging with what we're doing. These can be really life-enriching. And often again, the people at the head of these things are women, and the people championing are women. So really, if we'd just let women be in charge a long time ago, we would have fixed this situation by now. And I sound like I'm being flippant, but I'm not. If there are issues that are in place for the male sector of society, they tend to be ones that are dealt with quickly. The ones that are there for women, not quite so much. We're seeing a tide turn in that, and I also think we're seeing a massive uplift in men who are supporting feminists in this, and I think that's really positive as well.
So if I may, I think there's still quite a bit to do. It's not just about the stuff, it's not just about the sanitary products. In the former East Germany, women were allowed what was called a Haushaltstag, which was a day at home, up to 2 a month. Because that was the time when women not all women, but many women would be suffering from acute period pain. Yeah. And I do think, that we really need our employers, our schools, our universities to actually be thinking about how do we build our institutions around the needs of women's bodies. Because they've been built around the needs of men's bodies. And I have sat many a time in many a meeting sitting there feeling slightly sick and slightly faint with cramps in my stomach, starting to sweat and wondering why I'm just not quite concentrating on the agenda items in a meeting. And that then has all kinds of knock-on effects. It means that I can't speak out in that meeting quite as easily because I'm managing my own pain and my own body. Now, multiply that across the 51% of women in the world who, and you will start to understand the extent to which this then affects the ways in which decisions are made. So I think there's a lot more to do around that. It's lovely that, for example, my own institution, the University of Glasgow, has acknowledged that the symptoms of menopause require reasonable adjustments by a line manager. And I think this is a real way forward, but we've still a long way to go before we actually design our institutions together for equality.
Well, I think that's really crucial because what we're doing now is positive and it's a move forward, but it's an add-on, an adjustment, a wee side swerve. It's not designing systems that allow it, because the reality is if you look at the political system, the democracy we now have is something that came from lots of men being in charge of things and them adding wee bits on now and again. So that means it's something that has evolved from something imperfect to begin with. So a bit of work needs to be done to create the perfect in the first place.
Well, we are going to come on to some of those issues in a little while, but for now, let's talk about Alistair Jack, the Secretary of State for Scotland, the Secretary of State for Scotland. He has been talking about how a bridge is really a tunnel, and also about how immigrants both take our jobs and steal our benefits. It's almost impossible again to know where to start with this because it's such absurdity. But first of all, on the racist issue, because it is flat out racism, to say that immigrants are both stealing jobs and stealing benefits is absurd, manifestly untrue. Both cannot be true. There is a contradiction in terms, and yet it is the kind of rhetoric that we hear from right-wing politicians all the time.
Yeah.
What can we do about it?
Yeah. Not give it airtime. Not give it airtime. Not amplify it. Not repeat it. Not contion it. Not allow it to take up space. I would say was the most important thing we do. And then tell the truth. Tell the truth. Tell what the evidence says. Academics have done this work. Researchers have done this work for years now. The evidence is in. In countries where there is immigration, the GDP of that country will be raised. Now, we can have a different conversation about whether economic growth is always a good thing, and that's an important conversation to have, particularly in the context of wellbeing budgets. We can look at the evidence on in intercultural research about what happens when people come together from different perspectives for decision making and for research and for understanding and for education, and bring perspectives that are formed and forged in different languages and different cultures, and what we get are better solutions to common problems. So, for example, I've just been working in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and there is a major housing crisis in Aotearoa, New Zealand, just as there was after World War II. After World War II, a large number of Jewish refugees were resettled to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as part of the fixing of the housing crisis, the expertise, particularly of Jewish architects, was brought into play. And the architecture that those Jewish architects brought to that country was a big part of remedying the design and the problems that there were with the housing crisis there. There are numerous examples and numerous stories we can tell, and we should tell, and we should keep telling. It's been lovely watching some of the research that's been done on people's understanding of social security and where they gain their social security. That's been done with people who are migrants from A8 countries, particularly in the rural parts of Scotland, where it's really clear that people don't have the same understanding of social security that we might grow up with if we've always lived with a welfare state. But that doesn't understand that they don't have really valuable understandings of neighbourliness, of sharing, of caring for one another, of maybe learning each other's languages if they're not learning English in order to do that, that are part and parcel of building a society where people are looked after and where their welfare is central. So for me, it's about not condemning what he says, because to me, that is giving him more airtime. It's actually about telling the stories that are good. And yes, of course, we always need to speak out. We always need to stand in the gap for those who are not able to do so ourselves. When we hear and we see people doing these things, there is a place for calling that out and making sure that people are safe and people are well protected in the public space. But in terms of this, which is yet another dead cat, then don't give it airtime.
I'm almost loath to say any more about it now. One statistic that always jumped out at me was that roughly a third of people who emigrate to Britain create businesses that employ at least two people, and therefore at least cover the employment of everybody who moves to the UK. Yeah. So, you know, and as Alison says, there are hundreds of examples that show how nonsensical this argument is. So instead, let's talk about the bridge to Northern Ireland that Alistair Jack claims actually means a tunnel, proving that, you know, words generally are difficult for him. What do you make of this idea? Is this whole idea of a bridge to Northern Ireland, is it another dead cat, as Alison says? Is it just let's talk about something big that will make people care about that and stop looking at what we're doing over here?
Yes, I do think that's what it is. And what I'll firstly say is, I'm not, as an individual, particularly against the idea of either a bridge or a tunnel. But what I do think is that if we are talking about major infrastructure projects between two countries, then the people talking about those major infrastructure projects should be those countries and the local authorities within them. Alistair Jack can suggest, but other people are the ones who will be producing and living with this, should it ever happen, which I think it probably won't. I think it shows complete disrespect from both the devolved governments that would have a bridge they haven't asked for foisted upon them. And I think it's typical of the whole situation in the UK at the moment. I watched a bit of BBC Question Time the other night, and a gentleman a gentleman very succinctly said, instead of saying, you know what we think, why don't you ask what we think? And I would say, as both someone who thinks that the Scottish Government has an intrinsic right to be part of discussions about this, and someone who is in a local authority and understands the pressure that it puts on local authorities and the amount of time that they contribute to these projects, maybe ask us what we think about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a huge project, as you were saying just before the show, the number of local authorities that would be involved and the amount of effort that goes into collaboration between two local authorities. You were talking about a bridge yourself that affects your own constituency.
That's part of one of the City Deal projects. So I'm a Renfrew councillor. There is a bridge that will go between us and Cllr that's in development just now. It is a project between 3 local authorities, and the volume of work that's required to enable a project of that level is significant. And that's just 3 local authorities with a little river in between them. A magnificent river, but a small one compared to the Irish Sea. You know, so when you multiply that to different governments that have their own political issues, local authorities, the merchants who will be required to do these things, the builders, you're talking about long-term, very heavily involved projects, and these are things that, should it be decided they should happen, all partners should be involved in discussions about it, and it's incredibly dismissive. The other thing I would think is that if money is going to be spent in Scotland, we should be part of deciding how the money is spent, because there are perhaps other infrastructure projects that the money could be better used for.
And one of the things we do know about the present Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is he likes his big projects which have his name on them, you know, the Boris Bikes and all the other projects that were part of the time when he was Mayor of London. So I think we'll see quite a lot of this, and we'll be suddenly in a position where you're having to have an opinion on whether you think you should have a bridge or a tunnel, when actually there are far more important questions to be asking about what will make this country flourish.
Of course, this is the man who spent millions and millions of pounds on his garden bridge project that ended up not happening at all. So anyway, we move now to the wacky world of American politics, where we have seen Elizabeth Warren drop out of the race this week. Contrary to many reports, it does not now mean that there are no women in the race. Tulsi Gabbard is still technically in the race. She does have delegates. She will have a role at the convention in July. But it does look very much like it's a choice between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders for who's going to face Donald Trump. So first of all, do you have any thoughts on Elizabeth Warren and her contribution to the race, and also the fact that so many women started the race? It was at one time the most diverse race in the history of the country, and now it's down to 2 old white men.
Yeah, these are hard times, and it's a bitter pill to swallow when you know what a difference it makes having good women in politics as representatives. I would say, however, having grown up in the 1980s, that not all women who are leaders of countries are necessarily going to have the best interests, in my view, of a country at heart. And so it doesn't mean that every man in power is bad and every woman in power is good. I think we have to get away from these really simplistic ways of thinking that women's leadership just automatically means things will get better for women. I've been under the leadership of women where things have got better. I've been under the leadership of women where things have got worse, and the same for men. So I think we need to avoid that simplistic thinking. That said, to have the courage to stand, to have the courage as a woman to stand, where you know that you will be on the end of violent misogyny, to have the courage to put yourself into the public arena, to have the courage to be somebody who will allow every single move, every twitch of your eyebrow, every single transaction that you have ever made in your bank account, everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done, be mauled in public, requires immense tenacity, and any woman who puts herself through that in the context of the United States of America deserves our respect for doing it, whatever political party they are part of. And those are my thoughts, really. Yes, I am really sad that she is no longer part of the race. I'm really sad that in 2020 it still hasn't been possible to get to a place where between 2020 and 2024 we have the hope of having elected a woman as president of the world's largest power. That saddens me greatly, but that is where we are, and it tells us what the work is that we need to do and how we need to redouble our efforts around supporting people who are women in power and in powerful positions.
Yeah, I mean, we've had 2 female prime ministers in the UK, and as Alison says, not necessarily making great strides for women's advancement. But at the same time, there is still a blockage in lots of politics, even in Scottish politics, which is better than most, for women to get into politics, for women to achieve in politics. And in America is one of the worst. This will link into what we're going to talk about in a minute about Scottish politics more generally. What's your experience as a woman in politics, and what's your what differences do you think we can make that would help to make it easier for women to get into politics? So,
my personal experience in the process of becoming a politician was largely positive. I'm from a political party that has a gender balance mechanism. My lovely branch said that they would have chosen me anyway, which is a nice thing. But I think things like gender balance mechanisms are important until we get to the point where we are electing people because of the contribution they can make and not based on their gender, which we still are. They are necessary. Largely positive, I have to say. Positive campaign, local people who were very supportive generally. My experience since I've been in politics is a very different thing. Comments like, the council is now being run by wee girls cutting about in flowery dresses. Now it is being run by women walking about in flowery dresses, but I am not a wee girl. I am a 34-year-old woman with expertise and the capacity to do my job. And perhaps if we'd had more people with expertise and the capacity to do the job in the past, we wouldn't be in the state we're in. Mm-hmm. I've had a degree of the horrific rhetoric that's thrown at women generally, some because of my specific politics and some because I'm just a woman in politics. Yeah. Obviously, I share a party with people like Mary Black and Susan Aitken and Nicola Sturgeon, who get some of the most horrific abuse I have ever seen on not a daily basis, but a minute-to-minute basis. I watch my First Minister say things that I think are concise and measured and careful, and I see lots of support and then torrents of abuse follow it. So one of the first things we have to do is change public discourse and how we speak to and about women in politics, because it is very difficult. And you're right, if you don't have a degree of brass neck about you, which I definitely have, it's challenging.
Yeah.
The other thing is that politics is not set up for people who have family lives, caring lives, any sort of responsibility. Of that level, you know, we have at Scottish Parliament level, we have some constituencies which are enormous, and we have women in them who have children and are travelling vast lengths of the country to do very, very important work. But that can take its toll on you when people are also screaming hateful abuse at you when you're just trying to make things better for people. I also think that the institutions of politics are not set up for women really at all. What you tend to find is that groups make space in ways that they can to support people. But those things are largely based on a group of people making space. They're not there in the institutions. Scottish Parliament is pretty good compared to others, but given that we've had two very strong female elected representatives in Gail Ross and Aileen Campbell say that they're going to step down this week, both of which I respect their decisions, but I'm quite devastated about, because they are both women who speak very strongly for people. Given that we have people like them of their calibre stepping down, it shows the work that needs to be done. You know, things like childcare provision, adjustable hours, considering that, you know, a woman who has children might not be able to be at meetings for 14 hours a day. Using the vast amount of IT we currently have to do meetings, if we can do it for transatlantic things, why can't we do it for things in our own country? It'd be better for the planet as well. I'm just throwing that out there. There's a lot of work to be done.
And Alison, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit just before the show started, about how just we design these systems, as Lisa said there. Gail Ross and Aileen Campbell both choosing to step down, in part because they're huge constituencies a long way from Edinburgh. They're doing a lot of travel and they're finding it just difficult to manage that, particularly with family responsibilities. But we never ask the question of family responsibilities about men representing far-flung constituencies. You know, both the Orkney and Shetland represented by men. We don't ask how their families are coping, but we do think, you know, well, what that woman, how's she going to manage with her family and her job? What's the? I mean, you know, we're not going to solve entrenched misogyny in the 7 or 8 minutes we've got left, but what steps do you think we could start to take to change this, so that we have a system where, firstly, women find it easier to enter politics and stay in politics, and secondly, to where we start asking the same questions of men that we ask of women?
Well, I agree with Lisa. Changing the discourse in public life is really important. Making it a space that is safe for women to feel that they can inhabit is absolutely vital. And the present context of abuse that women receive, what they have to put up with in the public domain if they are working in the public domain, is extremely difficult. To be constantly on the end of that and to be constantly building your courage again after you're knocked down is no small thing. It's really important to have a strong, respectful debate and discourse about everything that is difficult to talk about, and change is always difficult to talk about. Asking a group of people who have enjoyed the benefits of power to cede those benefits in the name of the common good will produce some defensiveness, some backlash, and also some real torrents of abuse, as Lisa has said. And so finding ways of actually doing that are also acknowledging those who are making way and making room, and letting others lead, and letting them lead and design things in ways that they might not have wanted to otherwise. In my own work, I see this in working with people from international backgrounds, and particularly from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. I see and work with a team which is multiracial and which is multilingual. And we have to make adjustments. Not everybody speaks English with the rhetorical power that I can command, having had years of privileged education in languages as a native speaker of English. So that means making room. It means shutting up. It means trying to say things differently. It often means working in ways which aren't necessarily about text-based ways of working. They're sometimes about more oral ways of working, more artistic ways of working. That actually in the end makes things nicer for everybody, but you still have to, as the person in power, adjust your behaviours. So we're asking for an educational project that helps boys and men adjust their behaviours so that all can be seen as equal. And that's going to take time. We are not going to fix it today, as you said. This is for the medium and the long term, and it is an educational project. And overall, it's an educational project for peace, founded in justice. And I think many of the ways in which our schools at the moment are looking at what does gender justice look like? What does it mean? How do we outlaw behaviours which do not support an equal society around race, around gender, around class, around many of those intersections that we know are present? For me, at a very minimum, I'm a liberal feminist. At a very minimum, I think we need, at the moment, we need certain quotas. We need certain things to bring equality for women, and then also equality for people of black and ethnic minority background. It's why one of the really good things that's happened for the university system in Scotland has been the looking at postcodes and who comes to which university from those particular postcodes, really understanding and looking at privilege. All of those things can help, but they're only a first step. They're only a first step to actually creating a society where we won't even have to think twice about these questions. Where, for example, my partner, when he decides to care for his elderly mother, won't be asked how he's going to cope in doing that, because that will be very difficult for his wife to deal with. That we're not making these assumptions at every level of every generation, but we're actually seeing the work of care for everyone is the work for everybody, and that we need to structure a society that will enable that to happen, and not say the work of care is only, and the way we do it at the moment, is only for a particular set of migrant women on very low pay. So pay is also really vital, really thinking about how we really prioritise the jobs that we think are important that might have been gendered in the past. In my own institution, the real way we will overcome the gender pay gap is by actually understanding that those jobs which are the lowest pays are often most undertaken by women, and that is where the new and radical steps need taking, so that we start to close the pay gap in ways that actually look at professions and look at how we value them.
Yeah. One piece of data that I saw a while back showed that women, it's not that women gravitate towards low-paid work, it's that work that women tend to do becomes low-paid.
Absolutely.
There's a book that literally everybody in the world should have to read, especially if you have any interest in making policy. Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. It's fascinating. Changed my whole view of the world. It's a fantastic book. It talks all about how data isn't collected about women, about how the world is designed with male as the default. It's shocking, horrifying in places, but will give you a much better insight into all of this if you're like me, just a stupid man. That is just about all we've got time for. I should point out the period poverty issue. Monica Lennon deserves a good deal of credit for that. We didn't mention her name. Oh, sorry, and I'm getting a voice in my ear, and I thought that's what she said. But actually, I said give a shout out to Maggie Lennon, one of our regular hosts here. Sorry, it's also very very important. Both people very important. Lots of people with Lennon in their name, very important. But Maggie has been ill for a while. She is one of our regular hosts here. She would almost certainly have been hosting today, but she has been ill. We're very sorry not to have her here for some weeks now. It's one of the reasons I've been sitting in so much. So Maggie, if you're watching, please do get well soon. We miss you a very great deal, as I'm sure our viewers do. So anyway, sorry, while I stumble over things that I'm getting told in my ear and things that I'm getting trying to think about, that is all we've got time for now. So thank you so much to Alison and to Lisa. It's been a really great show. Thank you at home for watching as well. If you're a fan of Broadcasting Scotland and you would like to support us, we'd be very grateful for anything you can do to help. If you'd like to support us financially, please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up as a supporter. Your £5 a month can make an enormous difference to the quantity, quality and type of programmes that we can produce here. We want to be a full-service broadcaster, providing the kind of broadcasting that Scotland deserves, but we can only do that with your support. So if you are able to support us financially, please do. If you can't, please don't worry. The shows will always be free to view online, but you can still help us. We don't have a marketing budget at all here. So if you're able to tell your friends, if you're able to share the shows on social media, talk to people about why you watch Broadcasting Scotland, what you get out of it, the kind of fascinating guests, the kind of conversations that we have here, we think it makes a real difference to the discourse in Scotland. But the only way we can spread the word is with your help. So please do that if you're able. And also, if you're interested in getting involved here, as I say, I've been hosting here for quite a while because Maggie hasn't been available. We would love to have more women hosting shows here, but we just don't have very many women stepping forward to host here. So we would love it if there are women out there, or men, who are willing to get involved. There are jobs in front of the camera and behind the camera, working in the control room, working behind the cameras, working on our outside broadcasts. There's so much to do here, and we need your help with that as well. So if there's anything that you think you can contribute to Broadcasting Scotland, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. I do believe Alison is going to be hosting next week.
Next week or the week after, yeah.
So you can look forward to that. I'm sure she will do an outstanding job. And I'm sure we'll have Lisa back sometime soon as well.
Anytime.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again to Alison and to Lisa for joining us. It's been a really great show. And thank you for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. Gordon will be here then. So until then, have a great day. Cheers.